We left off part 1 with me wanting to redo my side panels because they weren't thick enough. But I couldn't get a 16-quarter soft maple, so I got 2 more 8-quarter boards and I was going to laminate those together. But I wasn't too particular picking them out, apparently, because one of them had the pith at one end, only for a few inches, so it was just one section that I couldn't use. But for the whole length of the board, the center of the tree was pretty close to being in the board, and I had an extra inch or so of width for each board. So I thought rather than just cutting an inch off one side, I would cut an inch out of the middle, and that would eliminate the most unstable part of the board. And I guess to make up for all this extra work, the woodworking gods decided that they would make the other board I got turn out to be curly. Now that didn't really help me, because I can't have one side of the table be curly maple and the rest of it not be. But I guess I could have the center be curly, so I'm going to save that board for that. And I'm going back to the 2 panels that I already glued up, and I decided I would just cut those apart back into 6-inch wide boards. Those panels had already been cut to width, so I'm losing a little bit of width. When I glued those up, I wasn't really worried about how flat they were going to turn out, because they were going to be grouted anyway. And I really don't have a good way of flattening an 18-inch wide board. So it's much easier to cut it apart and get it so it fits on the joiner. And I can laminate 2 6-inch wide boards together 3 times, and then joint those edges, and then glue the 3 together to make one thick panel. The next thing to do is to make the ends of the side mate with the top and bottom. To do that, I'm going back to the same jig that I used on the top and bottom. First I marked a square line as close to the end of the panel as I could, and then another line 3/4 of an inch below that. Then I put the panel in my end vise with that lower line flush with the top of the table, and that let me put a 3/4 inch piece of MDF that would give me my pivot point for the jig. So doing it this way, it should theoretically mate perfectly with the top, but the cut I'm getting in the end grain is not very clean, and the top needs to be sanded. So by the time all that's taken care of, I have no idea whether it's going to actually fit very well or not. And I don't have to go all the way so that the whole surface is curved, because a lot of that material was getting removed when I wrote the sides. When I put the first one in, I hadn't set up the ring that supports the end of the jig. So when I put the second one in, I couldn't get in close enough, and I was just trying to hold it with my fingertips by the time you get almost all the way in, and I dropped it. So the trick was to get the vise tight enough so that it was just barely loose enough that it could move. And I got it in, and then I realized that it wasn't lined up with the center line on the jig. So I loosened it, and I turned it again. I laughed it off the first time. I was less amused the second time. Moving on to routing the sides. This time I'm not going to be using a rotating jig. The router is going to be mounted to a pair of curved rails, and those rails are going to sit on another pair of curved rails. When I did the top, I had tried sliding the router inside the curved rails. It didn't move smoothly. So this time I decided I would mount the router directly to the rails and make them just long enough so I could slide the whole rail. Before doing any routing, first I removed as much material as I could at the table saw, and it really would have made sense to cut some of that middle piece out before gluing it up at the bandsaw or whatever. But when I'm just sort of making things up as I go along, I try to delay decisions like that for as long as possible, because you try to get too cute with saving materials, and sometimes you just end up screwing it up and you have to start over again. And on that note, I'm staying far away from the line that I drew. So here's the bottom part of the jig, and I've drawn marks on both sides on 1/4 inch spaces, and each 1 inch mark I have a color-coded mark that's going to help me line up the jig as I'm moving it around. So after each pass, I would move the 2 stop blocks and one on each rail, to the next line. All of that moving of the stop blocks really made this part of the process go really slowly. But the good part of this particular jig, it pretty much had a wall all the way around it, other than one end where I left open for the camera. So the chips did not go flying everywhere. You're probably a little disappointed about that, aren't you? So I would just stop every now and then and vacuum it out. When you get down to it, this jig is really very simple. It's just a piece of MDF, and put in the side panel, screw in some stops around it to keep it from moving around, screw on the curved rails on the sides, and add in some bracing to keep those rails from flopping around. Up to this point, you could really make everything I've done with a router and a jigsaw. Now flipping over to the convex side, I had notched out the rails for clearance for the handles in the router. Now that edge is going to be the one that's on the jig, so I have to patch those. So out of all the jigs so far in this project, this is without a doubt my least favorite. The difference between this and the other side is now the router is wanting to tip over all the time. So you're having to fight against it. I was also really tired of moving the stops around, so on this side I decided I would just skip that and just do my best to keep it perpendicular to the rails. I didn't end up with as nice of a surface as I did on the other side, but it was close enough. I would go as far as I could to the maximum plunge depth of the router, and then add in some blocks to raise the panel up. What you may be able to notice in this shot is that the side ends up thicker in the middle than it does on the edges. That comes about because I used a smaller radius on the inside curve, the curved rail, than on the outside. And that translates to the outside of the side having a smaller radius than the inside. I did that intentionally because I want the edge to be the same thickness as the edge of the top, but it gets thicker in the middle, so it's stronger, and that's also going to make it easier to do the joinery later on. Because the side is made from two pieces of 8-quarter laminated together, there's a very noticeable circle on the inside of the sides. I knew that was going to be an issue. I guess I didn't really appreciate how much of an issue it was going to be. Fortunately, on the outside, it's much less of a problem. It's really just in the corners. There's a part of the design for this table that I've really been going back and forth on whether I want to do it or not. It would really help to minimize this particular problem. I'm still really not sure if I want to do it. When I try to picture the finished design, I have a hard time picturing it without having done that. So I think that's a pretty good indicator that I should do it. But there's still something sort of holding me back. So the only way I really see forward is to build a prototype. I don't normally do any prototyping, and in the middle of a project is sort of a weird time to build one. But that seems to be the way to go. So that will probably be the subject of the next video in this series.